Good morning, everybody. I'm Steve Gannon from McGonigle, soon to be Davis Wright Tremaine, by the way. Our firm is merging as of July 1st. But let's jump right into it since we've had introductions. We've talked, our panelists talked a little bit ahead of time, and I think one of the sort of underlying themes, even though it's not in the headlines there, is in terms of digital assets, this is sort of an inflection point where, in many ways, the adults are coming back into the room. And that's going to be very much needed, I think, as these markets develop. Pardon me, they're obviously quite volatile. They need stability. We're going to be talking a lot about that today. And sort of to kick it off, one of the things that is the very first word up there is disruption. There has been, obviously, disruption that digital assets have driven through the financial markets, and now digital assets are getting disrupted. But digital assets exist because they have a particular kind of infrastructure, and they work in a particular way. And as a general proposition, that all has worked, and it is working. And so, Hunter, you spend a lot of time thinking and working with macro issues, infrastructure and the like. I wonder if you'd share a few observations about how is the market looking from a macro perspective and from an infrastructure perspective today so that the disruption and the volatility can be managed?
Yeah, definitely. So I think just to start, when you talk about like structure of financial interactions, even though we've seen a lot of volatility in the markets recently, everything worked like the way that it should have. Even with the whole Luna debacle, everything was kind of known and transparent, and you could take an educated bet based on that information. What I've been looking at more recently is the actual structure of the existing financial system and kind of what drives a lot of volatility, right? Right now, everyone every day is talking about the Fed and their monetary policy. And they're making, I guess as best a guess as they can, but they're operating in a very opaque system where they don't even know how much money exists, right? And so two of the key markets that really drive every sort of downstream financial market is like the repo market and the Eurodollar market, both of which we don't really have all the information. And so when I think about digital assets and distributed ledger technology, I think about how it can impact those areas of finance, which ultimately affect us on our day-to-day. We're seeing volatility play out because we don't have that type of transparency, and the Fed and other financial institutions are making a best guess, but we can do much better in terms of engineering a system that we can then kind of tweak and tailor to achieve the goals that the Fed is setting out to achieve. But right now it's tough. It's tough. So if you bring transparency to some of these systems, we can actually engineer outcomes much better than we have in the past. And there's obviously a lot of debate in terms of whether the Fed is doing the right thing or the wrong thing all the time. And so that's something that I've been much more interested in recently, as I've kind of realized that nobody really knows what they're doing up there, and it's a function of this just kind of archaic system where you don't know how many times an asset has transferred hands, whether it's been rehypothecated 5, 6, 7, 8 times, how much leverage is in the system. In crypto, you can get a much better idea of that, and we can do better in crypto as well in terms of quantifying how levered the system is. And so that's something I'm really excited about moving forward, to see the application of this technology to existing financial markets.
And so is your view that as crypto develops and as it broadens and as it, along with broadening, more transparency comes into the system, that adds more stability into the system?
Yeah, I mean, I think the system is going to evolve like drastically over the next 5, 6, 7, 8 years. Like you said, there's an opportunity for the adults to come into the room, and I think a subset of the space as it is will continue to exist, but we're going to see a lot of this technology applied to the equities markets, the bond markets, right? So each crypto asset might just be a tokenized representation of these existing securities and still leveraging the underlying technology. And so will it bring stability to some of the assets that aren't tied to existing securities? Maybe, maybe not, but it will bring stability to the overall financial system for sure. Because now, again, we call it a system. It's not an engineered system in its current state, and so we have no control over it. And that's when we see things kind of get out of hand, like we've seen recently too, right? There's been, obviously, crypto has been hit hard. Equities have been hit, equally hard, maybe if you consider how quickly they recover. And so, I think just preventing the big blow-ups so that people's 401k does not drop 25% in a couple months is something that we should be striving to achieve.
You used the word stability, and so I'm going to pivot to TEANA a little bit, and we'll talk some about stablecoins. Stablecoins obviously have been in the news incessantly, certainly since the UST debacle, and there's a lot of I think misunderstanding in the system about stablecoins because there are many different kinds of stablecoins. In fact, I would say that other than fully reserved stablecoins, the other varieties, if you will, really probably should have other monikers like, I don't know, algorithmically pegged coins or something like that. TEANA, let's talk about stablecoins a little bit. Your company has one of the best performing stablecoins, one of the biggest, USDC. They are now moving into Europe with Eurocoin. Talk a little bit about the kinds of stablecoins that are out there and how you think the fully reserved stablecoins can lend stability to the market as opposed to the volatility that we've seen from some of these algo coins.
Sure. So I think what we've seen over the past, several weeks is that not all stablecoins are created equal, right? And we hear that said often. The moniker, as you've called it, of stablecoin is kind of an unfortunate name. It's one of those things where somebody started calling it that and it stuck, and it's not. It doesn't really describe the different types of asset construction or design that stablecoins can take. So really, there's three buckets of stablecoins, broadly speaking. There are fiat-backed, reserve stablecoins like USDC, or Pax Dollar is another one. There are asset-backed stablecoins, which gets a little confusing, but typically these have a basket of a variety of assets. So they can be other currencies, dollar, euro, yen. They could be precious metals. They could be equities. So there's typically more than one asset that sits in that basket that's meant to stabilize or hold the peg for that stablecoin. And then there are algorithmic backed or based stablecoins, which is what UST was. And then within this algorithmic category, there's a number of ways that you can algorithmically, secure a stablecoin. And the, UST was even a little bit different than perhaps you've heard of something like DAI. That's another algorithmic stablecoin that doesn't have any of the other kind of convoluted, token layering that UST had with Luna, et cetera. So I think it's important to kind of understand what we mean or what we're saying when we talk about stablecoins. Ultimately, they are meant to hold a value. So they are not meant to go up, they are not meant to go down. They are meant to be stable, as the name implies, which then allows them to be useful for a number of different things. Every token should have a use case. There should be a reason for the token. Ether is used as gas on a number of platforms. Stablecoins can be used for payments. And they should be very effective and efficient use for that. What we've seen traditionally is that stablecoins have been used, the birth of the stablecoin, when you look back to Tether, one of the first, was so that traders could move crypto assets around without having to trade out into fiat. And the reason for that was there weren't a lot of avenues or options for them to do so. So, the maturing of the market, and we're looking at, infrastructure changing, from a regulatory and policy perspective, a number of these platforms now have access to those fiat channels, which makes it easier to move from that stablecoin into fiat if you so chose. And so, that's where these institutional grade stablecoins come in and why they're attractive to financial institutions and other types of market participants, and payments being a use case. Obviously, if you're touching rails like Visa or MasterCard, you want to ensure that if the stablecoin that you're using to facilitate those transactions should be backed one-to-one, should have full capital reserves, where those capital reserves are held, how often they're audited, and attestations, disclosures, etc. All of those things come into play to ensure that what you say you have, you really have, and that they are redeemable in a very short time horizon, one for one, always.
I'll make my background is a banking background, and I'll just make this comment that stablecoins have an incredible utility in payments. And one of the drivers for the advancement of digital assets in general is going to be payments. As friction gets taken out of the system and adoption becomes broader, they're going to be that use case almost can't be stopped, in my humble opinion. The other thing is, if the audience members want to see something that's kind of interesting, you could, and our firm is just finishing up a position paper with the Global Digital Cryptocurrency Association that ought to be out in a couple of days. A picture's worth 1,000 words. You can trace on a chart the activity in early May of UST, and obviously it's a crazy line that then goes down to zero, and plot against that the activity of the 4 major stablecoins, and they're a total flat line. They are not, that contagion did not happen. So the notion that you heard in the press.
For the fully reserved.
Yes,
yes.
They're all fully reserved.
Yeah.
And the notion you had in the press that all stablecoins are like volatile just doesn't work out. So let's talk about volatility a little bit, because one of the things that's happening in the market now is there are plenty of sales of crypto going on to cover margin calls and deal with leverage and the like. And Cynthia, that kind of gets into your world. I know you, from a tax perspective, represent a lot of hedge funds. Give us some insights into what's going on in the market and what people should be doing and thinking about in terms of planning how to get through this period of volatility.
So generally speaking, we don't have a lot of tax guidance, but we do have some tax guidance around these asset class. So the first piece of guidance came out in 2014, which was Notice 2014-21, which told us that these assets are property, and the general property rules apply. That guidance has carried forward through all future guidance. So mainly speaking, when you have a margin call and you're being liquidated, the issue that these fund managers need to realize is if your assets are liquidated, not only are you losing your assets, but now you may be triggering a taxable event to your investors, because that liquidation, depending on what your cost basis was in those assets, when they're liquidated, it's treated as a sale. So if there's appreciation, which there may be, there may not be, depending on the market today, you could either be triggering a gain, which now you don't even have assets to sell to actually cover that gain because the assets were liquidated into the protocol. One other aspect of thinking about this is a lot of fund managers are looking for ways to access offshore markets and offshore protocols that don't allow US persons. So through doing this, they might be using some sort of leveraging with an outside party, and if there are losses that are occurring in that outside entity where the fund itself doesn't have equity, those losses don't come back to your investors. That's owned in that other entity. You actually don't see the loss until you close that lending transaction. So there are a lot of concerns around the strategies that you're using and kind of understanding the tax implications of how you are investing in this asset class to ensure that when there is a downside, you get the benefit of that downside, your investors get the benefit of that downside. Talking to your tax counsel, talking to your attorneys when you're structuring your investments and getting into those offshore markets is really important, because I think a lot of people just didn't have that understanding when they got involved in certain lending transactions, realizing, yes, there can be a margin call, but if your assets are locked on another protocol and you can't access them to, feed into that margin call, then you're going to be liquidated, and you have to plan for that through reserves within your entity. Again, this is not investment advice, it's all risk tolerance. But, just kind of keeping into consideration, if early in the year you had a really great appreciation gain that you realized, so you transferred out of a token, it was an incredible win for you and your investors, you have to make sure you have a reserve to pay that tax, because at the end of the year, if all the assets go down in value, that appreciation that was realized early in the year is still going to be taxable to you. The IRS doesn't care that your asset class, if you had Luna, went to zero. They want their money for the appreciation that you realized early in the year. So when you are actively trading these assets, making sure you have a reserve, whether that reserve is held in fiat or if it's held in a stablecoin that actually does have a reserve and has an attest to show the reserve is really there, is fine, because you might want to earn the yield. I understand a lot of our fund managers kind of do a mix between fiat and holding in stablecoin for the yield. But just keeping in mind, taxes don't go away because the market had a downturn. If you had tax realization early in the year, you have to make sure if you're going to pay out gain on your K1s to your investors, that most of the time the investors are going to expect to see some sort of distribution to help them cover their tax liability. Also, risk tolerance. So depending on what position you're taking, like there's a lot of questions around staking income. Is that actually income upon receipt or is it income upon sale? From my perspective, it's a little less of a question. There's definitely something a position I would take, but talk to me about it later. But if you're taking one position based on your risk tolerance and the IRS tends to disagree with you, having an understanding of how the audit rules work in this space as well. If you have a pass-through entity or partnership, you can't just amend your return. There's going to be an administrative adjustment that has to be done, and you have to make that decision as, is the fund going to cover those underpayment of taxes, or are you pushing that out to your investors who might not have been in the fund at the time that you took that position? So open communication, understanding your tax implications when you're investing in this asset class, because of that property treatment, it's going to be a lot different than investing in other types of assets or investing in currencies. So just being mindful of liquidation, taxable event, having reserves, because even if the market has a downturn, you still have your taxes to pay. And as far as generally speaking, I'm talking about your investors have their taxes to pay. You're flowing this all out. Also, there's a lot of rules for traditional funds that might not apply to this asset class, because we don't have a specific definition as to what type of property these assets are, whether they be securities or commodities. We might at some point in the future, but right now we just don't have that clarity. So a lot of times we look at these more as commodities than as securities, unless there is specifically some sort of equity backing on that token. So therefore, there's something called the wash sale rules, which prevents tax loss harvesting, which means that you can't get out of an asset and then back into the same asset within, it's usually 60-day windows. You look 30 days back, 30 days forward, and recognize that loss. So in this instance, the wash sale rules really shouldn't apply. We don't have anything under 1091 that specifically applies into digital assets. So right now, in a down market, there's an opportunity to have tax loss harvesting for future gains that you might recognize in the future to carry that forward. So just something to consider. Again, talk to your tax counsel, talk to your attorneys, make sure that you're making the best decisions for your fund. You want to think about holding periods and things like that when you're dealing with tax loss harvesting. It's not 100% everybody should be doing this. It's really more on the overall strategy of the fund. But just keeping in mind, there are some strategies that you can take and some structuring that you can do to help mitigate some of the risk in the liquidating provisions that's going on now.
So one of the things I think that underscores is that crypto is a little bit more complicated than number goes up. So it's, and we're now obviously in that period of time. One of the things that is something that has hung over the head of digital assets for a while is the whole subject of security. And is the blockchain secure? What about all these hacks? Is crypto only used by criminals? That sort of stuff. There is a lot of work the industry has to do continually to demystify that. And particularly in the stablecoin space, you'll notice that more and more, and USDC is one of the leaders in this, there have been attestations that have come out that analyze the assets that compose the reserves. And Johnny Lee with us from Grant Thornton, his firm actually does the attestation work for Circle. And so Johnny, turning to you, talk to us a little bit about the security of the blockchain, some of the work that you all do, both on the audit side, but then also on the forensic side, when that actually is necessary and when it's important to go ahead and trace assets that are on the blockchain.
Thanks, Steve. Yeah, two very different camps, right? The audit work that we do, people are generally pleased to see me, right? We're there on an assignment. The forensic work, not so much. For the attestation work, it's really just a question, and Cynthia mentioned this earlier, about sort of getting into this space with the rather resounding absence of guidance, right? We started doing the attestation work for crypto exchanges and coin issuers back in 2014, and there was no regulatory guidance. There was some tax guidance, but it was pretty high level. And I think just going into that space with the forensic mindset was key, right? We needed to be independent because we knew we already had humorless regulators. We didn't want to irk them. We needed to have an arm's length way of testing things. We needed to have our own ledgers, right? We run our own nodes. We do not rely on third-party explorers. There were certain tactical things that we made decisions on early in our adoption so that we could go back to regulators and say, and you foreshadowed this in your preamble, the grown-ups are here, right? We know how to do this. This is a very traditional service, financial statement auditing, applied to a very dynamic and novel arena. And so we're going to inject as much independence and as much arm's length testing that we can. And it's not rocket science, right? Everything's on the ledger. But it will probably shock no one in this room to learn that blockchain developers do not contemplate auditors when they build anything. So a lot of these derivations were very challenging, right? Some of these nodes are not stable. That seems to be the adjective of the morning. Some of them have ledgers that take months to synchronize. That is not a pleasant thing to share with the audit partner who needs an answer next week. So there is methodologically, there's a way to do this in a very sequenced, grown-up fashion. And 8.5 years later, we've gotten that down more or less to a science. On the security side, I think that's, to me, a lot more akin to the late 90s when I was a young developer and going through the .com, when the focus, like today in crypto, is build it. Just build it. We can secure it later. We can worry about regulatory scrutiny later. Just build it. And I think this particular epoch that we're entering, or now firmly in, I think, is reminiscent of that. And Steve, I want to ask you for your thoughts on this, because as I was making that observation during our prep call, you mentioned the similarities to...
You don't get to ask the moderator a question.
No, it's coming. To the banking community, right? So for me in the .com arena, it really was a focus on having to tell our clients, you've built this really elegant thing, but it's terribly insecure. What do you mean you're going to do that in 2.0? We kind of need to have it baked in from the beginning. Sometimes we'd win that battle, sometimes we wouldn't. But there was a way to do these things, but there are things that venture capitalists and entrepreneurs don't particularly like. It's something called delay that security sometimes introduces. And if you look at many of the most substantial thefts and rug pulls this year alone, it's in eminently preventable things, right? Bridges with too few synchronizing nodes, really zero attention in the design or architecture of a system for security. And many of those, leaving aside the collapses and the other sort of market force things, the security issues are really preventable. And my concern was a shared one, I think, about what the industry needs to do before the regulators step in to help. So I'd love your thoughts.
I'll be happy to comment on that. One of the good things about the move of digital assets into the sort of banking perimeter, if you will, is that in the sort of fallout from the crisis in 2008 to 2010 or so, the banks did develop, and by the way, banks developed at the behest of regulators, a set of tools in connection with their response to what the OCC called heightened standards that really did help reduce the risk in not only bank portfolios and credit, but also in operations. Those tools still exist, and they can be used in the crypto space, for example. And by the way, they all revolve around the concept of safety and soundness. So transparency around what's in reserves. On top of that transparency, you easily can add an analysis and assessment of the liquidity of the assets that are in the reserves. What can be liquidated today? What's going to take 5 days? What's going to take 14 days? What's going to take 30 days? The more you put information out into the market, the less traders and others will suffer from a fear of information asymmetry. And therefore, they will be less inclined to, in quotes, run. Another thing that banks are required to do, banks obviously use models of all kinds, particularly in connection with credit analysis. They are very much subject to model risk management and analysis. Those tools exist. They're not something that has to be reinvented again or Einstein has to figure it out. They are in the toolkit and they can be pulled out and applied today. In my humble opinion, for algorithmic stablecoins, they should be applied, and that should be transparent. The OCC and the FDIC have been very clear that for banks to get involved in the digital asset space, they're going to have to do it in a way that's consistent with safety and soundness. They're going to have to get letters of non-objection, and you have projects going on right now, like the USDF consortium, where they're building on Figure's provenance blockchain a stable coin of their own for this consortium. That I think there's going to be a lot of learning that comes out of the process of seeking non-objections from the regulators in that space. So I'm clearly there's education that needs to be done. Long term, I'm very optimistic about it. I think that once this is done, once the tools are in place and they're used, you don't have to reinvent new tools every time. They're in the toolkit. You pull them out, you use them. So I'm long-term optimistic. Tina?
One of the things, though, I'd just add to that, and it's not, to counter what you're saying, but a number of the pieces of legislation that we've seen proposed for stablecoins takes into account that the premise that stablecoins should be regulated like banks, right? And there's different degrees of that.
Right.
But one thing that we need to keep in mind is that banks take in deposits to lend.
Right.
Stablecoin reserves are supposed to sit there and be available. And so, when I look at legislation that says, okay, we're going to put all of these reserves in FDIC-insured institutions, and you're going to have to undertake a stablecoin insurance, and we're going to require, it's like and, right? I do think that we need to take a look at, we just de-risked this credit concentration risk within banks through Dodd-Frank. We just Dodd-Franked this out. And before we start putting all of this risk back in, I do think that we need to take a look at what those toolkits are and what's applicable for an unhypothecated asset reserve.
Yeah. Stablecoins don't engage in maturity transformation.
Correct.
And that's obviously the key to why sometimes banks do experience runs. And so that is, so to stay on policy for a moment, because the policy and the proposed legislation is all over the place, I'm actually going to pivot to CYNTHIA a little bit. So we haven't talked about the infrastructure bill yet, and the sort of massive reporting requirements that go along. Well, massive depending on who you talk to. Reasonable if you talk to the IRS, but massive if you talk to somebody in the crypto space. The reporting requirements that are embedded in that legislation, and the concern is both not only the burden, but the sort of possible privacy intrusion. And in fact, there's litigation about this that has just been launched in Kentucky. Can you give us a few comments on how you perceive, is that a chimera? Is it really going to be burdensome? Are there going to be privacy risks? And how would you advise your clients to deal with it?
So right now, the infrastructure bill actually had two sections in it that dealt with cryptocurrency. It wasn't specific to tax. It was more on information reporting, which as Steve pointed out. So it's an expansion under the rules under 6045, which talks about broker reporting for someone who's facilitating a transaction in digital assets. It's a very broad definition. There was some discussion on the committee floor that tried to say this was not intended to affect certain people, but however, those discussions did not make it into an amendment that made it into legislation. So we still have this very broad definition where it could scoop in a lot of people like software developers, miners, stakers, who just don't have the information on the counterparties that they are interacting with to actually do proper broker reporting. So broker reporting is done on a Form 1099-B. And it essentially provides, you have to provide cost basis, you have to provide fair market value, you have to provide a lot of information on your counterparty, like their social security number or ITIN, depending on who they are, their name, their address. These are all things that in the digital asset space we just don't have. And how do you actually act? Like the exchanges might have that, depending on which exchange you're using. If it's a US-based exchange, more likely than not, they will have that. So this type of reporting makes sense for the exchanges. unless they might not have cost basis, but for the most part, they know who is on their exchanges, they know who has accounts. But someone who's mining, someone who's staking, someone who's selling nodes, like they don't have that information as to who they're interacting with to actually do that proper reporting. So what we're hoping, what we're looking for, is a reduction in that definition through regulation to kind of work off the committee statements on the floor to narrow it down so it's not going to be so much of a privacy invasion. Because right now, as it stands, it would be impossible for most people to actually follow through with that. But the reporting doesn't start until January 1st, 2023. So there's a little bit of time to actually get, hopefully, 6 months, to get some sort of regulation. There was a new bill that came out, actually, TEANA and I had worked on providing comments to, which was Senator Lummis and Senator Gillibrand, and they had a reduction in that reporting obligation, reducing that definition to make it a little less broad. Unfortunately, I don't know if that bill is going to go anywhere. As it stands, it still has to go through committee before it even hits a vote on the Senate floor, and then obviously would have to go to the House. But there is an understanding that the infrastructure bill was too broad. I think the legislators know that, but there was no other way in the moment to get something passed, so they went with the overreaching, and they said specifically, oh, we'll whittle this down through regulation.
But then what happens too with, so that happened in the US, and then maybe you might want to just talk a little bit about what the OECD is doing, because in the US we had requirements around the BSA reporting, and then FATF took that to a whole new level. And now everybody has to rise to the FATF level. So even if we get this solved within the legislation, does the OECD's reporting proposal then potentially change what we have to do in the US?
I would say yes, because think about it from a FATCA CRS perspective. So the United States came out with FATCA, which was financial asset reporting for U.S. persons who are holding foreign accounts. Only the United States has FATCA. We have IGA's intergovernmental agreements, which essentially other countries will report when U.S. persons are invested in certain financial institutions in their countries. But almost every other country under the OECD has common reporting standards. The United States said, no, we have FATCA, we're good, thanks. But that doesn't mean that U.S. persons are outside of CRS. We still have to handle it because it's a global market. We are invested in asset classes outside the United States. So you have a U.S. fund manager who might have a whittled down 1099B reporting, but they're still going to be subject to the expanded OECD reporting because they're based in Cayman, or they're based in BVI or Bermuda or Singapore, wherever they may be. So you're absolutely right. The global reporting standards and everybody trying to almost one-up each other in a way is definitely going to be an issue in this space, because I don't want to get too, theoretical here, but the whole purpose of this was privacy and autonomy and being able to control your own assets and your own information, and we've kind of, the way the government is pushing is almost reeling that back and saying, well, no, we really do need to have all this information. And I don't think that that's necessarily a bad thing in certain instances, to know who you're transacting with. Obviously, you don't want to have a money launderer who can be a money launderer because they don't have to request any information or where they receive their assets. But there's a line where is regulation going too far and where is regulation appropriately needed and moving forward at the right pace. I think the infrastructure bill was overbroad, and I'm trying to be nice about it, because I don't think that there wasn't reporting required. I believe that 1099B reporting was already required in certain instances. It didn't really change much for me. It was just a clarification. The definition that they used was overbroad, and that was the problem, not necessarily the reporting itself. But from the OECD perspective, yeah, it's gonna get rough, guys. Yay.
So what you guys have discussed is actually something you see oftentimes when the government has to respond to an issue where maybe it's not as well educated as it might otherwise be. And so I want to circle back to Hunter for a macro perspective. What does, in your mind, pulling the camera back, what does good policy look like? What would be some of the elements of good policy that, from a big picture point of view, from a systems point of view, would help the market and not hinder it with a whole bunch of, let's just throw the kitchen sink at what appears to be a problem?
Yeah, I mean, so I'm definitely less of an expert on policy and kind of legal frameworks, but I think having financial professionals get together with some technologists to quite literally recreate a 21st century kind of financial system. There are a lot of frictions and inefficiencies in the current financial system, like cross-border payments, for instance, right? And the pain of sending money to sending US dollars to somebody in Japan and having them receive yen, right? Like most of those transactions just don't even happen because of the friction. But I think, taking it a step further, programming in rules to how financial transactions can happen. And I don't think it's going to come from just the crypto community by any means. Most DeFi applications were created by technologists building financial applications as opposed to financial professionals building applications with just better technology, right? And so that also leads to some of the volatility in the market. And so what I would like to see, it's not necessarily, I guess you could call it policy, but is, for instance, the Fed has models that they use to conduct their open market operations, which is really the kind of, they're trying to just control liquidity in the market, but there are no rules governing how they actually, how what they do manifests in the real world, right? There's all these kind of extraneous situations that just pop up because of how markets operate. And so what I would like to see is, financial professionals get together to say, okay, how do we architect a system that is fair and rules-based so that we can kind of control this beast? And I think, that'll provide stability globally for financial markets to, kind of thrive, because you can now allocate capital properly to the areas where, it's most needed.
That's great. So we'll wrap up. We're out of time. When we did our prep session, by the way, we went for about, I think it was like an hour and 15 minutes, and we were continuing to talk and come up with new ideas and thoughts. I think this whole conference is going to be a tremendous just merging of ideas and concepts, not only around this space, but around others. So I want to thank my panel. I thought you guys were great. And Vivek, thank you very much. And I think now we're on to our next panel.